In the summer of 1993, a soil core breaks through wet Louisiana clay and comes up red. Not the pale brown of the topsoil around it, a deep rust red streak, packed hard, clearly placed there on purpose. Archaeologist Joe Saunders turns it over in his hands. The ridge his team is standing on has always been called a low hill by locals, nothing more. But this core doesn't belong to a hill. It belongs to something built. And when the radiocarbon results come back weeks later, the number attached to that red clay will be older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids of Giza, built, somehow, by people who had no farms, no metal, and no permanent towns. That's the first problem. It won't be the last. The place is called Watson Brake, a stretch of quiet bottomland near the Ouachita River in northern Louisiana. Before Saunders and his team arrived, it was the kind of site archaeologists walked past. Low, grass-covered rises. No stone architecture. No obvious grandeur. The kind of landscape that looks, at first glance, like nothing happened here. Farmers had worked fields nearby for generations without anyone flagging the low ridges as anything more than natural high ground, useful for staying above the seasonal flooding of the bottomland. You crouch beside the auger hole with Saunders, watching a stripe of red clay come up that has no business being that old. It is compact, distinct, clearly a separate layer laid down deliberately. Not by wind or flood. Someone carried this earth here, basket load by basket load, and packed it into place. The question is who and when. Fieldwork in this part of Louisiana is not glamorous. It is humid, buggy, unglamorous work, sweat running into your eyes as you push a metal auger into ground that gives up its secrets one narrow core at a time. Mosquitoes rise in clouds off the standing water nearby. The heat sits on the bottomland like a held breath. This is not a scene of dramatic discovery in the moment. It's slow, patient, and easy to miss if you're not looking for it. That's part of what makes Watson Brake so unsettling. Once the truth comes out, nobody was expecting to find anything important here at all. The team logs each core methodically, numbering samples, bagging soil for the lab, moving to the next probe point with no idea yet that the numbers coming back will rewrite a textbook chapter. Mapping a site like this takes time, and it takes more than one field season. Saunders and his colleagues didn't simply walk the property once and declare it significant. They returned repeatedly, correlating surface topography with subsurface soil profiles, cross-referencing auger cores taken at dozens of points across the property to build a composite picture of a shape too large and too subtle to read from any single vantage point on the ground. Only once that composite picture came together did the full oval plan become clear. The site itself, once mapped, turns out to be 11 earthen mounds arranged in a broad oval, enclosing a central plaza. Some of the mounds reach several meters high. Connecting ridges link them together into a single continuous shape, built up gradually, in stages, over roughly 500 years. This was not a single afternoon's labor. It was a project passed down, generation to generation, by people returning to the same spot again and again to keep building, adding new layers on top of old ones, expanding the ridges a little further each time they came back. And then, the radiocarbon dates return from the lab, and the picture stops making sense. Watson Brake dates to roughly 5,400 to 5,300 years ago, somewhere around 3,500 BCE. That number needs a moment to land. The Great Pyramid of Giza would not be built for another 1,000 years. Stonehenge's earliest phase was still centuries away. And here, in the swampy lowlands of what is now Louisiana, people were already raising earth into deliberate, engineered shapes, working without metal tools, without draft animals, without a single wheel to move the load. Here is the problem. The old assumption, the one nearly every archaeology textbook repeated for most of the 20th century, was simple. Monumental construction requires agriculture. It requires food surpluses, storable grain, a settled population that isn't moving with the seasons, and usually some form of centralized authority to organize the labor. Pyramids need pharaohs. Temples need priesthoods and granaries behind them. Large-scale construction, the thinking went, is what happens after people stop wandering and start farming. Watson Brake breaks that rule before it was ever supposed to exist. The people who built these mounds were not farmers. They were seasonal hunter-gatherers, moving through the landscape to follow fish runs, nut harvests, and game, gathering at this spot only at certain times of year. They had no pottery yet, no ceramic technology at all, no domesticated crops, no evidence of the kind of rigid top-down political structure archaeologists once assumed was a prerequisite for monument building. And yet they organized themselves across roughly 5 centuries to move an enormous quantity of earth into a deliberate, symmetrical form, returning again and again to a landscape that offered them fish, nuts, and game in reliable seasonal abundance, enough, it seems, to support gathering and building without ever settling permanently. That doesn't fit the old model. So the old model has to bend. Some researchers argue Watson Brake points to a form of social organization archaeologists hadn't expected from a mobile hunter-gatherer society, coordinated leadership capable of directing labor across generations, even without agriculture underneath it. Others are more cautious, suggesting the mounds could have grown through repeated, smaller-scale communal gatherings rather than any single organizing authority, a kind of accumulated ritual behavior rather than a planned architectural campaign. What the evidence shows clearly is the earth itself, distinct construction stages, a 500-year building sequence, and no confirmed burials inside the mounds, which rules out the simplest explanation: that this was simply a cemetery. Beyond that, the exact social machinery behind Watson Brake is still an open question, and archaeologists are honest about not fully knowing the answer. When Saunders and his colleagues, working with a team that included radiocarbon specialists, published their findings in the journal Science in 1997, the paper did something quiet but seismic. It pushed the known date of mound building in North America back by nearly 2,000 years in a single stroke. Before Watson Brake, archaeologists believed monumental earthworks on the continent began with later, agricultural societies. After Watson Brake, that timeline had to be redrawn, and every assumption built on top of the old timeline had to be checked again. It did not destroy the entire picture, but it forced researchers to redraw part of it, and it opened a door that would keep opening again and again as more sites like this one were re-examined across the American South and Midwest, this time with the possibility of far greater age taken seriously from the start. Stand at Watson Brake today and you would not immediately see a civilization-changing discovery. You would see low grassy rises, quiet water, maybe a heron picking through the shallows. Nothing about the place would warn you that beneath your feet is proof that so-called simple societies were capable of something researchers, for most of a century, insisted only complex ones could do. And that's really the first mystery inside a much larger one. Because Watson Brake, as old as it is not the earthwork most people picture when they hear about ancient mounds in North America. It's not the one that ended up in school books, or town names, or 19th century newspaper headlines. The mounds most Americans have actually heard of are younger, sometimes by thousands of years, and far more numerous. They stretch across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys by the hundreds, some of them enormous, some geometrically precise, some shaped like animals stretched across the landscape. Some of those later mounds are burial sites. Some are geometric enclosures with no clear burial function at all. Some are shaped like animals, stretched across hilltops in forms only fully legible from directly above. The tradition Watson Brake represents the earliest known chapter of did not stay fixed in one form. It grew, diversified, and, in places, escalated into structures far larger and more elaborate than anything its earliest builders left behind. A 5,000-year continuum of monumental construction, evolving across dozens of generations and multiple distinct cultures, all connected by the same underlying willingness to reshape the land itself into something deliberate and lasting. And when European settlers first encountered those mounds in large numbers in the 1700s and 1800s, they did not respond with the same scientific curiosity a soil core would demand 2 centuries later. They responded with something closer to disbelief and, in places, outright fear. Farmers near some of the largest mound complexes avoided breaking ground too close to them, wary of disturbing something they didn't understand. Antiquarians measured and sketched the earthworks by lantern light, arguing over who could possibly have built them, and the answer most of them settled on was not the truth. It was a story. A story about a vanished race of mysterious, more advanced builders, refugees from a lost continent, a lost tribe from the ancient Near East. Wandering Phoenicians, even giants, anyone, it seemed, except the indigenous peoples already living on the land the settlers wanted for themselves. If hunter-gatherers with no farms and no metal tools were already capable of organized generational monument building 5,000 years ago at Watson Break, then the deeper question is not whether Native American ancestors could have built the mounds that came after. The evidence says they clearly could, and did. The real question is why 19th century Americans, standing on top of earthworks far younger and often far larger than Watson Break, refused to believe it. Consider what it actually means for a site to be older than agriculture in a given region. Agriculture is often treated, in popular retellings of human history, as the hinge point where everything changes the moment scattered bands of foragers become villages, then towns. Then the kind of organized societies capable of leaving monuments behind. Watson Break sits on the wrong side of that hinge. It exists in the world before the hinge, built by people who were, by every technological measure archaeologists use, still living the same foraging lifestyle their ancestors had practiced for thousands of years before them. And yet there they are, moving Earth by the basketload into a shape complex enough that 5,000 years later, a trained archaeologist can still recognize a deliberate oval when a corer pulls up its edge. That single fact is the engine driving everything that follows in this investigation. If the oldest known layer of North American monument building already breaks the rules researchers assumed had to be true, then every later, younger, larger earthwork built after Watson Break deserves to be looked at with that same willingness to be surprised, rather than filtered through assumptions that were already proven wrong at the very start of the story. That refusal has its own history. It has its own evidence, its own driving assumptions, and its own consequences that lasted for more than a century. To understand it, the story has to leave the soil lab behind for a moment and step into the world of the people who first stood on these mounds and decided, against the evidence in front of them, that someone else must have built them. Lantern light flickers across a sheet of survey paper in the 1840s, somewhere in the Ohio Valley. A team of men, surveyors, amateur antiquarians, sometimes accompanied by curious locals, kneel in the grass beside an earthwork too large to fit in a single glance. They are measuring it by hand, pacing off distances, sketching contour lines by candlelight because the work has run past dusk. Ink smudges on damp paper, canvas tents pitched at the tree line, dense woods pressing close around a site that has only recently been cleared enough to survey properly. One of the men straightens up, looks at the shape rising out of the dark field in front of him, and asks the question that will define an entire era of American thought. Who built this? By the mid-1800s, this scene was playing out again and again across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. Surveyors like Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis were mapping hundreds of earthworks, geometric enclosures, burial mounds, effigy shapes, some of them enormous, some clustered into complexes that stretched for miles. In 1848, Squire and Davis published their findings as Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, the first major scientific survey of these structures, issued through the fledgling Smithsonian Institution. It was, in one sense, real science, careful measurement, careful documentation, maps that archaeologists still consult today. But it also poured fuel onto a myth that was already spreading fast, because measurement alone couldn't answer the question everyone actually wanted answered: who? Here is the old assumption, stated plainly, because the documentary needs to say it plainly before it can be dismantled. Many 19th century Americans believed indigenous peoples were too primitive to have built these monuments. Not too few in number, not too recently arrived. Too primitive, lacking, in the settlers' eyes, the social organization, the planning, the sustained labor discipline that structures like this seem to require. That would be simple, if not for one detail. It wasn't true, and there was already evidence sitting in plain sight proving it wasn't true. European explorers who had traveled through the Southeast centuries earlier, chroniclers accompanying expeditions through the Mississippian world in the 1500s, had written home about organized, populous, agricultural native societies, towns with granaries, chiefs, planned settlements, extensive maize fields stretching along river valleys. That testimony existed. It was in libraries and printed accounts, available to anyone who cared to read it. It described exactly the kind of social complexity capable of building mounds. And yet, 2 and 3 centuries later, many of the descendants of the very people who wrote those accounts stood on top of the mounds and decided the builders must have been someone else entirely. That is the real contradiction of this chapter, and it matters more than any single earthwork. The myth wasn't built out of missing evidence. It was built out of a refusal to accept evidence that already existed. It helps to picture the physical reality these surveyors were actually confronting, because the scale is what makes the refusal so striking in hindsight. By the mid-1800s, thousands of mounds had already been documented across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, not a handful of curiosities, but an entire landscape reworked by generations of deliberate construction. Some were modest burial mounds a few feet high. Others were geometric enclosures spanning dozens of acres, with earthen walls precise enough that later surveyors using modern instruments would confirm angles and proportions that seemed almost too exact for casual construction. Confronted with that volume and that precision, a 19th century surveyor had 2 options: conclude that the ancestors of the native peoples living nearby had built an extraordinary, continent-spanning tradition of monumental architecture, or invent someone else to give the credit to. Enough of them chose the second option that it hardened into conventional wisdom. Historian and archaeologist Kenneth Feeder, in his book Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, traces the arguments that circulated to justify this refusal down to a recurring set of claims, 5 of them appearing again and again across the decades. Indians, the argument went, were too primitive to have organized the labor. The mounds seemed too ancient to belong to people still living in the region. Some reported inscriptions on artifacts appeared to use foreign alphabets, misreadings, later shown to be exactly that, patterns mistaken for script. When asked directly, some native people told settlers they didn't know who built certain mounds, which was taken as proof of an unrelated origin rather than what it more plausibly was. The builders belonged to a much older layer of the same continuous history, sometimes centuries removed from the people being asked, the way a modern American might not know who built a specific Roman ruin without. That gap disproving Roman ancestry of anyone living nearby today. And metal artifacts recovered from some sites were assumed to require outside contact, when in fact regional trade networks explained their presence perfectly well. None of these arguments needed to be true. They only needed to feel true to people who had strong reasons, political, economic, and deeply personal. Not to credit the people they were actively displacing with monumental achievement. Crediting native nations with this scale of accomplishment would have complicated the moral story settlers were telling themselves about the land being empty, unused, or unearned by its original inhabitants. Popular lecturers and writers helped spread and entrench the theory well beyond scholarly circles. Illustrated books and traveling exhibitions presented reconstructions of the imagined lost race, complete with speculative depictions of their appearance and customs, none of it grounded in physical evidence, but all of it dressed up in the visual language of serious inquiry. By the time this material reached ordinary readers and audiences, it carried the authority of published scholarship, even though its central claim, that native peoples couldn't have built the mounds, rested on nothing more than assumption dressed as conclusion. Into that gap poured theory after theory. Popular explanations for who really built the mounds included refugees from a sunken continent, a lost tribe of ancient Israel, wandering Phoenician sailors, seafaring Vikings, Toltec or Aztec migrants moving north, or, in some of the more fantastical retellings, a vanished race of giants. None of these theories were supported by physical evidence. All of them shared one convenient feature: they moved authorship as far away from local native nations as imagination allowed. It's worth pausing on Squire and Davis specifically, because their work embodies the contradiction at the heart of this chapter almost perfectly. Their survey methods were genuinely careful by the standards of the time, precise measurements, detailed maps, systematic documentation of dozens of sites that might otherwise have been destroyed by farming and development before anyone recorded their original form. Much of what modern archaeologists know about mounds later plowed under or paved over comes directly from their published plates and measurements. And yet the interpretive framework surrounding that careful documentation leaned heavily on the assumption of a vanished, non-indigenous builder culture, treating the actual living native nations of the region as largely irrelevant to the question of authorship. Good data, filtered through a predetermined conclusion, is still capable of reinforcing a wrong answer. The unease wasn't only intellectual. Near Cahokia, a site the documentary will return to at length later, early settlers reportedly avoided farming too close to the largest mounds, wary of disturbing something they sensed was sacred or dangerous, even as they dismissed the idea that the ancestors of the people still living nearby could have built it. You stand where a surveyor once stood, looking at an earthwork too big to explain with the tools of the time, and you can almost feel that same tension, awe at the scale of the thing, paired with a stubborn refusal to draw the obvious conclusion about who made it. This was not a fringe belief confined to uneducated settlers. It ran through respected scientific circles for most of the century. Newspapers speculated. Popular lecturers toured with theories about the vanished race. Even some trained naturalists and antiquarians, otherwise careful observers, lent their credibility to explanations that had no supporting evidence beyond the assumption that native peoples couldn't have done it. Respectability, in this case, did nothing to make the underlying claim more accurate. The mound builder myth, as historians now call it, would stand largely unchallenged in mainstream American thought for decades, even as the physical evidence supporting the true builders kept accumulating, and even as the true age of the very oldest mounds kept getting pushed further back, underground, waiting to be measured by tools that didn't exist yet. That reckoning was still 50 years away. Before it could arrive, science itself needed better tools, and archaeologists needed to actually excavate, carefully, stratigraphically, layer by layer, rather than simply speculate from the surface with a tape measure and a theory already in mind. That work would eventually happen. But it would take a Smithsonian-funded, multi-year survey and a mountain of artifact analysis to finally settle the question with data instead of assumption. The myth had practical consequences beyond the intellectual argument. It shaped how mounds themselves were treated. Some were leveled for farmland without documentation, on the assumption that whatever was inside belonged to nobody with a living claim to it. Others were dug into carelessly by treasure hunters looking for evidence of the imagined lost race, destroying stratigraphic context that later, more careful archaeologists would have desperately needed. Every mound plowed under or looted before Thomas's later survey is a mound whose evidence is now permanently incomplete, a cost the myth imposed on the scientific record itself. Not just on the people it misrepresented. It's worth pausing on why the myth held on as long as it did, because the reasons aren't simply ignorance. Some of the men promoting alternative builder theories were otherwise careful observers, capable of precise measurement and careful documentation, the same skills visible in Squire and Davis's survey work. That combination, real observational rigor paired with a refusal to draw the one conclusion the evidence actually supported, is itself a kind of case study in how motivated reasoning operates even among people who consider themselves scientific. The measuring tape told the truth. The interpretation built on top of it did not. For now, in the 1840s, the myth is just getting started, and it has a very long run ahead of it. To understand how deep the true story goes, and how badly the myth misjudged the people it dismissed, the investigation has to go back even further than the Ohio earthworks these surveyors were sketching, back past the geometric enclosures and animal effigies, to a site even older and even stranger than most of what Squire and Davis ever mapped, a place called Poverty Point, where hunter-gatherers with no farms did something that shouldn't have been possible on an almost unbelievable scale. Seen from above, Poverty Point looks less like an ancient site and more like a fingerprint pressed into the Louisiana landscape. 6 concentric ridges, shaped like nested Cs, curve around a central plaza in northeastern Louisiana. From ground level, walking along one ridge, you would not necessarily grasp the scale of what you're standing on. The curve is too gradual, the ridge too low, and grass covered to read as a single continuous design. But from the air, the view archaeologists only got once aerial photography, and later drone and LiDAR surveys became available. The design snaps into focus, a massive, deliberate geometric earthwork built with a precision that looks almost like blueprint thinking laid directly onto the earth. You walk one ridge and realize it curves out of sight before you reach the end of it. Poverty Point dates to roughly 3,400 to 3,500 years ago, somewhere around 1700 to 1100 BC, younger than Watson Brake, but still staggeringly old, and still built before agriculture took hold in the region. Set against the sweep of human history more broadly, this places Poverty Point's construction in roughly the same general era as the Trojan War of Greek legend and the reign of some of ancient Egypt's New Kingdom pharaohs. Context useful less as a direct comparison of achievement than as a reminder of just how deep into the past this Louisiana earthwork actually reaches. The site is significant enough that UNESCO added it to the World Heritage List in 2014, placing it alongside some of the most important archaeological sites on Earth, a formal international acknowledgement of exactly how extraordinary its builder's achievement really was. Here is the old assumption this chapter has to break, that monument building requires long, gradual accumulation of labor across many generations, a slow architectural project passed down like a family trade over centuries, the way Watson Brake itself seems to have been built. That was the working model even for hunter-gatherer earthworks. Poverty Point doesn't just complicate that model, it shatters part of it. Recent research led by archaeologist Tristram Kidder of Washington University in St. Louis, using soil microstratigraphy, essentially reading the fine internal layering of the earth the way you'd read growth rings in a tree, found something researchers did not expect. Some sections of the ridges show no weathering layers between construction stages. No gap where rain, wind, or time left a mark before the next layer of earth was added. That absence is the evidence. It means those sections were not built up gradually over years or generations. They were built in weeks, or at most a few months, by a large number of people working together in a short, intense, coordinated burst. And this is where the story changes. If a single construction phase went up that quickly, it means the people responsible had to organize labor, logistics, and coordination on a level archaeologists once assumed only agricultural, hierarchically governed societies could manage. These were hunter-gatherers. No farming, no stored grain surplus to feed a standing labor force through a growing season. And yet, somehow, enough people gathered in one place, at one time, with enough shared purpose and enough food security from the surrounding wetlands and river systems to move Earth on an industrial scale for weeks at a stretch. Picture what that labor actually looked like on the ground, because the dump truck comparison is useful precisely because it's so alien to how the work was actually done. No trucks, no engines. Instead, rows of people carrying earth in woven baskets, walking from a borrow pit to the ridge under construction, emptying the basket, walking back, over and over, for as long as the coordinated effort lasted, hours stretching into days, days into weeks. Organizing that kind of repetitive, physically demanding labor at scale requires more than willing hands. It requires food for the workers, water, some means of directing where each basket load should go so the ridge takes its intended shape rather than an uneven pile, and enough shared motivation to keep hundreds of people returning to the same exhausting task day after day without the promise of a wage or a harvest at the end of it. Kidder has estimated the total labor involved at the equivalent of more than 140,000 dump truck loads of earth, carried and packed by hand, basket by basket. There were no wheelbarrows here, no draft animals, no metal tools. Every bit of that volume moved through human effort alone, coordinated well enough that entire sections went up, without the kind of seasonal weathering gaps that would show up if the work had been spread out over years. The mystery deepens the moment you look at what else was moving through Poverty Point. Excavators have recovered tons of stone that does not occur naturally anywhere near the site. Soapstone, quartz crystal, copper, and flint, carried in from sources hundreds of miles away, almost certainly through river-based trade and exchange networks stretching across a huge portion of the continent. A society without agriculture, without metal tools of its own manufacture, was nonetheless plugged into a long-distance supply chain sophisticated enough to bring exotic raw material to a single ceremonial plaza in the Louisiana lowlands, material that had to be carried, traded, and passed along river routes far beyond what a single community could have controlled on its own. That doesn't fit the old model either. So the old model bends again. The imported stone recovered from the site also raises a practical question worth sitting with. Why go to this much trouble for material that had no strictly functional necessity? Local stone, however limited, could have served basic tool-making needs. The deliberate effort to acquire soapstone, quartz crystal, and copper from hundreds of miles away suggests these materials carried value beyond simple utility, prestige, ceremonial significance, or some combination that made the enormous effort of long-distance acquisition worthwhile to the people directing it. That is itself a form of evidence about how this society organized meaning and status, even without a written record to explain it directly. Some researchers interpret Poverty Point as a large-scale ceremonial gathering site, a place where dispersed hunter-gatherer groups converged periodically for shared ritual, feasting, and exchange, the way later fairgrounds or pilgrimage centers would function, drawing people in from a wide surrounding region for a defined stretch of time before dispersing again. Others lean toward a more explicitly political reading, suggesting the coordination required implies emerging leadership structures closer to what archaeologists would normally associate with early chiefdoms, with someone capable of directing labor and negotiating the movement of imported goods. Kidder and his colleagues remain cautious about pinning down a single motivation. What the physical evidence supports clearly is the scale and speed of construction and the reach of the trade network. What it can't yet answer is exactly why people organized this way and exactly who was directing it. The mystery got stranger again recently. A 2025 geophysical survey beneath the Poverty Point Plaza revealed more than 30 buried timber circles, invisible from the surface, previously undetected by any prior excavation, sitting quietly beneath ground that generations of researchers had already walked, mapped, and studied without knowing what lay just beneath their boots. Their function is, as of now, unknown. They could represent successive phases of ceremonial construction, structural markers for gatherings, alignments tied to seasonal events, or something researchers haven't yet proposed. The ground beneath the plaza, it turns out, was still holding evidence nobody had found a way to see until very recently, and there is no reason to assume it has finished surprising the people studying it. The 2025 Timber Circle discovery is a useful reminder of how much even a well-studied, UNESCO-listed site can still be hiding. Poverty Point has been excavated, surveyed, and written about since the 19th century, its ridges mapped repeatedly with improving technology across more than a century of research. And still, in 2025, a geophysical survey using ground-penetrating instruments found more than 30 large circular features buried beneath the plaza that no prior excavation had detected. That is not a criticism of earlier researchers who worked with the tools available to them. It's a demonstration of how much of this story is still actively being written, and how confidently any documentary, including this one, should hold its conclusions about a site that keeps producing new physical evidence even after more than a century of study. Stand at the center of the plaza today, and the heat shimmers off the open earthwork rings in every direction. It is a flat, exposed, almost featureless-looking place at ground level, nothing like the grandeur the aerial photographs suggest. That contrast is part of what makes Poverty Point so easy to underestimate in person, and so hard to explain once you've seen it from above. Where the imported stone tools recovered from its ridges would glint, if you could see them still in place, against the pale local clay that surrounds them. If a hunter-gatherer society with no farming, no metalworking, and no written records could organize labor this precisely, move imported stone this far, and apparently build entire sections of a massive earthwork in a matter of weeks, then the label simple stops being useful. That word was doing a lot of work in the old model of pre-agricultural societies, and Poverty Point is direct physical evidence that the word was wrong. What does it mean for everything that came after if a hunter-gatherer society could organize like this, roughly 3,500 years ago? The honest answer is that it raises the ceiling for what archaeologists should expect from later, better documented cultures in the same region, cultures that had even more time, even more accumulated knowledge, and, eventually, agriculture layered on top of everything Poverty Point's builders had already proven possible without it. Consider the layout itself a little longer, because the geometry is doing real interpretive work. 6 ridges, each one a shallow arc, nested one inside the next like ripples frozen in earth, all oriented around the same central plaza. That kind of repeated, concentric precision doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen through casual, uncoordinated accumulation either. Someone held the whole design in mind, or in shared memory, passed between the people directing construction, before the first ridge was ever built, and everyone who added to later ridges had to work from that same shared plan closely enough to keep the pattern consistent across a construction footprint roughly 3/4 of a mile across. The imported stone recovered from the site tells its own story about what this place meant to the people who used it. Soapstone bowls, carved and fire-hardened, arrived already shaped from quarries far to the north and east, meaning some of what moved along these exchange routes wasn't raw material waiting to be worked locally, but finished goods, carrying whatever value and meaning had already been invested in them before they ever reached poverty point. Copper, likely originating from the Great Lakes region, appears in small quantities, suggesting either a very long exchange chain or direct contact reaching much further than researchers once assumed possible for a hunter-gatherer network this early. To understand where that ceiling first appeared, the investigation needs to go back one more time, past poverty point, back to the very oldest and strangest of these sites, the one that started this whole story, Watson Break, and the paper that forced the entire field to admit its timeline was wrong. In 1997, the journal Science published a short, dense, technical paper with a title that undersold exactly how much it was about to change: a mound complex in Louisiana at 5,400 years before the present. Lead author Joe Saunders, working with colleagues including Rolf Mandel and Roger Saucier, laid out radiocarbon evidence from Watson Break that placed its construction firmly in the mid-5th millennium BCE. Publication in Science specifically matters here. It is one of the most rigorously peer-reviewed general science journals in the world, meaning the paper's methodology and conclusions had already survived close scrutiny by independent experts before a single reader outside the review process ever saw it. For the archaeological community, this was the moment the new dates had to be accepted. Not debated as an outlier, not dismissed as contamination, but absorbed into the record as fact, checked against multiple independent samples that kept returning results in the same startling range. The real shock came when the samples left the site and entered the lab. Here is the old assumption this chapter needs to name directly. Pre-agricultural, pre-ceramic societies were believed to lack the social complexity required for large communal construction projects. Complexity in this model was supposed to follow agriculture, not precede it. Farming created surplus. Surplus created specialization, hierarchy, and eventually the organizational capacity to build monuments. Watson Break's builders had none of the first ingredient, yet clearly possessed the last one. The people conducting this fieldwork worked under conditions not unlike the ones described in the opening chapter: humid bottomland, careful sample logging, results that wouldn't be known for certain until processed labs weeks or months later. Science of this kind rarely delivers its biggest revelations in a single dramatic instant. It delivers them gradually, through repeated, patient confirmation, until a result that once looked like it might be an anomaly becomes, through sheer weight of consistent evidence, simply the new baseline everyone has to work from. Return to the 11 mounds arranged in their broad oval and look again at who built them. Seasonal foragers, people who moved with the resources, fish, nuts, game, rather than staying anchored to fields of cultivated crops. No pottery yet existed in their toolkit. No metal. No permanent, year-round settlement infrastructure of the kind archaeologists once considered a prerequisite for monumental labor. And yet the construction sequence at Watson Break stretched across roughly 500 years, layer by layer, generation returning after generation, to add to a shape that was clearly planned from an early stage. Not improvised mound by mound with no relation to one another. The oval arrangement itself argues for an early, shared design concept, something held collectively in memory and passed down long before any single mound reached its final height. That is a direct contradiction of the old model, and it's not a small one. It suggests that complex, organized, multi-generational construction projects can precede agriculture entirely, not just in this one Louisiana site, but potentially as a broader pattern archaeologists had simply never been trained to look for, because the assumption ruled it out before anyone thought to check for it elsewhere. It did not destroy the entire picture of how societies develop, but it forced researchers to redraw a significant part of it, in North America and by extension, in how archaeologists think about pre-agricultural societies worldwide, from the river valleys of Louisiana to comparable early monument sites studied on other continents. Consider, too, how unusual it is for archaeologists to be this confident about a construction sequence spanning 5 centuries without a single confirmed burial to anchor the interpretation. Most monumental sites researchers study elsewhere in the world offer at least some burial evidence to help explain function. A tomb, a cemetery, a single high-status grave that hints at social structure. Watson Brake offers none of that, at least not yet, which leaves its purpose unusually open even by the standards of an already uncertain field. That absence is not evidence of nothing happening here. It's evidence that whatever happened here left a different kind of footprint than the one archaeologists are most practiced at reading. What Watson Brake still can't tell researchers is why. No confirmed burials have been found inside the mounds, which rules out the simplest explanation that this was primarily a cemetery complex. That leaves several possibilities open: a ceremonial gathering site, a territorial marker asserting some kind of claim over the surrounding landscape, a seasonal meeting point tied to ritual or trade, or some combination that current evidence can't cleanly separate. The physical record shows the shape, the sequence, and the age. It does not show intention. Layered soil cores under laboratory light can tell you when someone packed earth into place. They cannot tell you what that person believed they were building, or why it mattered enough to keep returning to for 5 centuries. There's a temptation, in telling this story, to imagine Watson Brake's builders as somehow proto-agricultural, already halfway toward farming, even if archaeologists haven't found the direct evidence yet. The evidence available doesn't support that reading. What the site shows instead is something arguably more interesting: full monumental capability arising from a subsistence strategy that would remain in its basic form unchanged for centuries afterward. The people gathering at Watson Brake were not on some inevitable evolutionary path toward becoming farmers, who would then, eventually, become mound builders. They were already mound builders, without agriculture, and evidently in no particular hurry to change that arrangement. Faint flecks of charcoal recovered from hearths at the site hint at the presence of people gathering, cooking, living at Watson Brake during at least some of its construction phases. Small, human, ordinary traces sitting inside an extraordinary structure. Someone built a fire here. Someone cooked a meal here, on ground that would still be measured and argued over 5,000 years later. You picture the same group returning to this spot, generation after generation, for 500 years, with no writing to tell them why. Only inherited practice, inherited memory, and whatever oral tradition carried the reason forward long enough for their children and grandchildren to keep adding to the earth. There's also a question worth raising about how Watson Brake's discovery changed the way archaeologists search for sites in the first place. Before 1997, a low, grass-covered oval ridge in Louisiana bottomland would rarely have attracted serious excavation interest. It simply didn't match the profile of what a significant ancient site was expected to look like. After Watson Brake, and after subsequent related discoveries at other early sites in the region, researchers began reassessing similarly unremarkable-looking landforms across the southeast with new seriousness, aware that the profile of a significant site had been proven wrong once already and might be wrong again. Watson Brake didn't just add one site to the record. It changed what researchers considered worth looking for. The comparison points the documentary keeps returning to are not exaggerations, and it's worth being precise about what they do and don't mean. Stonehenge's major stone phases came centuries after Watson Brake's construction had already been underway for generations. The Great Pyramid of Giza was still roughly 1,000 years in the future. This is not a claim that Watson Brake is more architecturally sophisticated than either of those sites. It plainly is not, in terms of engineering complexity, stonework, or scale of individual structures. The claim is narrower and, in some ways, stranger, that organized, sustained. monumental earthwork construction was already happening in North America by people without agriculture before either of those far more famous projects began. And then there is the silence that follows. After Watson Brake's roughly 5-century building period ends, the archaeological record in the region goes quiet for a long stretch. Nearly 2,000 years pass before the next clearly documented wave of major mound building appears at sites like Poverty Point. That gap is itself a kind of unanswered question. Did mound building traditions continue in some smaller, less archaeologically visible form during that interval? Did the specific social or environmental conditions that produced Watson Brake simply not recur for 2 millennia? Was there a shift in climate, resource availability, or population that interrupted a tradition that might otherwise have continued unbroken? The evidence available right now doesn't provide a clean answer, and archaeologists are honest that the gap remains poorly understood. It's tempting, telling this story, to want a clean explanation for the 2,000-year gap, a single cause a documentary can name and move past. The honest version resists that temptation. Climate in the region did shift over that span, and shifting resource availability could plausibly have interrupted or redirected whatever social practices produced Watson Brake in the first place. But archaeologists studying the interval have not identified a confirmed, singular explanation, and pretending otherwise would misrepresent exactly the kind of evidence first standard this documentary has tried to hold throughout. What comes after that silence is not a diminished echo of Watson Brake. It's an escalation. By the time mound building reappears in force, first at sites like Poverty Point and then across the Ohio Valley in what archaeologists call the Adena and Hopewell traditions, the scale, the reach, and the complexity of what these societies were doing had grown substantially. Not just earthworks, but continent-spanning networks moving rare materials across enormous distances. Tying together communities that never met face-to-face, but were nonetheless connected by the objects passing hand-to-hand between them. It's worth being precise about what radiocarbon dating actually measures, since the whole Watson Brake story hinges on it. The method works by measuring the decay of a radioactive carbon isotope absorbed by living organisms during their lifetimes: wood, charcoal. Shell, bone, once an organism dies, the isotope decays at a known, steady rate, so measuring how much remains tells researchers roughly how long ago the organism died. At Watson Brake, multiple independent samples, drawn from different locations across the site and processed by different labs, converged on the same startling range of dates. That convergence matters. A single anomalous date might be dismissed as contamination or error. A pattern of consistent dates across many samples from many locations is much harder to explain away, and it's precisely that pattern that made the 1997 paper impossible for the field to ignore. The implications ripple outward beyond North American archaeology specifically. Around the world, archaeologists working on early monumental sites have generally assumed a similar sequence: settle first, farm second, build monuments third. Watson Brake is not the only site globally to challenge that sequence. Other pre-agricultural monumental sites have emerged from research on different continents in recent decades. But it stands as one of the clearest North American examples of a broader pattern archaeologists are still working out, that the human capacity for large-scale cooperative building may not have waited for farming to make it possible. It may, in some places, have come first. To see how far that network extended, the story now moves forward roughly 3,000 years from Watson Brake, into the Ohio Valley, where a burial excavation is about to turn up materials that had no business being there, unless the people who buried them were part of something far larger than any single village. An excavation team working in a Adena or Hopewell era burial mound in the Ohio Valley carefully brushes soil away from a set of grave goods, and what comes into view doesn't match the location. Sheets of hammered copper worked into ornamental shapes, thin, delicately cut silhouettes of mica, a mineral that flakes into fine, glinting sheets, marine shell, clearly not freshwater, clearly not local. In a museum drawer decades later, this same copper still catches torchlight the way it must have caught firelight in the ritual space it was buried in. Thin, bright, deliberately shaped by hands that understood exactly how to work it, hammered cold into forms that took real skill and real time to produce. None of these materials occur naturally anywhere near the Ohio Valley. That absence, confirmed through decades of geological survey across the region, is precisely what makes their presence in Hopewell burials so significant. There is no local source that could explain them away as coincidence or misidentification. Here is the old assumption, that societies in this region and time period, roughly 800 BC through 400 C, functioned largely as isolated, regional cultures with only limited contact beyond their immediate territory. Small worlds, small networks, small horizons, the kind of picture that fits neatly with an outdated view of pre-agricultural or early agricultural societies as fundamentally local in scope, each valley or river system treated as a largely self-contained world. The materials themselves argue otherwise. Copper recovered from Medina and Hopewell cites traces back to sources near the Great Lakes. Hundreds of miles to the north, mica has been traced to deposits in the southern Appalachians. Marine shell had to travel from the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic seaboard, carried inland by hand, by canoe, across river systems and overland routes, likely passed through many hands before reaching the Ohio Valley at all. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for its sharp edges, has been identified at some sites tracing back to sources as far away as what is now Yellowstone in modern Wyoming, a distance of well over 1,000 miles, crossing dozens of watersheds and, presumably, dozens of different communities along the way. This is not scattered, incidental contact. This is evidence of what archaeologists now call the Hopewell interaction sphere, an organized, sustained, long-distance exchange network connecting communities across a huge portion of the continent, centuries before any European ship reached these shores. Materials, and very likely ideas, beliefs, and artistic styles, moved along these same routes, carried by people who may never have traveled the full distance themselves, but who were nonetheless linked into a much larger web of exchange than any single village could represent on its own. None of this required a central government in the modern sense, or anything resembling the kind of unified political authority later Mississippian sites, like Cahokia, would eventually develop. It likely operated through a looser, more distributed system, regional leaders, kinship networks, and shared ceremonial obligations linking communities that never answered to a single ruler, but that nonetheless behaved in aggregate, like parts of a single functioning system when it came to moving valued materials across the landscape. That distinction matters because it shows organized, large-scale cooperation didn't require the kind of centralized hierarchy modern observers might instinctively assume was necessary. That is the implication worth sitting with for a moment. These were not scattered, disconnected peoples living in isolated pockets, each ignorant of what lay beyond their own river valley. They were part of an interconnected system operating at a near-continental scale, built without writing, without wheeled transport, and without any of the infrastructure later societies would consider necessary for long-distance trade. Whether this exchange represents direct trade in the economic sense, ceremonial gift-giving meant to build alliances and prestige, or something closer to pilgrimage travel tied to shared ritual sites, is still actively debated among archaeologists. Some researchers argue the pattern of high-value, non-utilitarian materials, copper ornaments rather than copper tools, shell used for decoration rather than practical purposes, points toward prestige exchange and ceremonial gift-giving rather than ordinary commerce. Others suggest a mix of motivations operated simultaneously, with the same routes carrying both practical goods and ceremonial ones. The physical evidence, the objects themselves, and the distances they traveled is not in question. The social mechanism moving them is. What is clearer is the scale of construction this network's communities were capable of. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, built by Hopewell-era communities, represent one of the largest complexes of geometric earthworks in the world. Enormous circles, squares, and octagons, laid out with a level of large-scale precision that some researchers argue reflects deliberate astronomical alignment, tracking the more complex, multi-year cycle of the moon rather than the simpler solar year. That interpretation remains debated in its specifics, with some researchers more confident in the lunar alignment than others, but the geometric precision itself is not in question. These earthworks were engineered, not improvised. at a scale that required planning across the entire construction footprint before a single basket of earth was moved, coordinating angles and distances across areas that would have been impossible to view all at once from ground level. It's worth dwelling on the Newark earthworks a little longer, because the astronomical claims attached to them are exactly the kind of finding that risks becoming either overstated or dismissed too quickly, and the honest version sits in between. Researchers studying the Newark Octagon have documented that its walls align with the rising and setting points of the moon across its full 18. 6-year cycle, a considerably more complex pattern to track and encode into architecture than the simpler annual solar cycle that many ancient monuments elsewhere in the world are built around. Confirming and predicting that lunar cycle requires sustained, multi-generational observation, passed down carefully enough that the knowledge survives long enough to be built into permanent architecture. That is a demanding intellectual and organizational achievement, regardless of what specific ceremonial or practical purpose the alignment ultimately served. A culture capable of moving raw materials across a continent and capable of encoding that kind of geometric precision into the land itself was clearly capable of more than isolated, small-scale ritual behavior. You hold a piece of mica in your mind's eye and try to trace, mentally, how far someone walked to bring it here, through how many hands, across how many river crossings, and the distance alone starts to reshape what simple society could possibly mean in this context. A single ornament becomes, on reflection, a kind of physical proof of a network most people never think to imagine existing this early on the continent. Consider what it actually took to move an object like a sheet of raw copper from the shores of Lake Superior to a burial mound in southern Ohio, a distance of several hundred miles as the crow flies, and considerably farther by any realistic overland or river route available at the time. No pack animals existed in North America capable of carrying heavy loads across that distance. No wheeled carts. The material moved because people carried it, on foot and by canoe, likely in stages, from community to community, each leg of the journey representing a separate decision by a separate group of people to keep the object moving rather than keep it for themselves. That is not incidental contact. That is a functioning system, sustained over generations. Reliable enough that Hopewell communities could count on receiving materials from sources they themselves may never have visited. It's worth noting how researchers actually trace these materials back to their geological sources in the first place, since the claim of thousand-mile trade routes needs some grounding in method, not just assertion. Different copper deposits, different obsidian flows, and different mica formations carry distinct trace element chemical signatures, subtle differences in composition tied to the specific geology of where they formed. By analyzing the chemical fingerprint of an artifact recovered from a Hopewell burial and comparing it against known signatures from possible source deposits, researchers can identify, with a reasonable degree of confidence, exactly which quarry or outcrop a given piece of copper or obsidian most likely came from. That is how the Yellowstone obsidian connection was established, and how the Great Lakes origin of much of the recovered copper was confirmed, not guesswork based on rarity, but chemical analysis tying specific objects to specific, distant places on the map. The burial context matters too. These imported materials don't turn up scattered casually across ordinary living spaces. They appear concentrated in mounds, in burials, in what were clearly special, ritually significant contexts, suggesting the objects carried meaning beyond their raw material value. A sheet of hammered copper wasn't simply a rare and pretty object. It likely represented status, spiritual significance, connection to distant and possibly sacred places, or some combination the archaeological record can gesture toward without fully translating. The people who buried these materials with their dead were making a statement about who that person was and what the community valued enough to send into the ground with them rather than keep in circulation. The scale of some individual Hopewell burial assemblages reinforces the same point. At certain mound sites, excavators have recovered caches containing hundreds of individual copper artifacts, thousands of shell beads, and worked mica sheets numbering in the dozens, all interred together in a single ceremonial context. Assembling a cache like that required not a single trade transaction, but a sustained flow of incoming material over what was likely years, if not longer. funneled toward a specific community and eventually a specific burial event. That is not the profile of occasional opportunistic contact. It's the profile of an established, expected, ongoing relationship between distant communities, reliable enough to plan a major ceremonial event around it. Some of the most striking Hopewell artifacts take the form of effigy pipes. Carved stone platform pipes shaped into animals, birds, and other figures, found across sites linked to the interaction sphere. Their presence at multiple, widely separated sites, sometimes carved from stone that itself traveled long distances before being worked, adds another layer to the picture, not just raw material moving through the network, but finished, symbolically loaded objects, carrying shared artistic conventions and very likely shared belief systems across a wide geographic area. A style repeated at sites hundreds of miles apart doesn't happen through pure coincidence. It suggests communication, shared training, or at minimum, shared exposure to a common artistic and religious tradition passed along the same routes that carried the copper and the shell. But encoding meaning into geometric shapes, circles, squares, precise angles is one thing. Somewhere among these same interconnected communities, someone did something stranger still. They shaped the earth itself into the unmistakable form of an animal, stretched out across a hilltop on a scale that can only be fully appreciated from above, and left behind a monument whose builders remain. Even now, a genuinely unresolved question among the archaeologists who study it. A research team kneels on a grassy hilltop in Adams County, Ohio, drilling a fresh soil core from beneath the base of an earthwork shaped like an enormous serpent, its body coiling in 7 undulating curves along a bluff above a creek. Drizzle beads on the exposed dirt around the coring site. This is a recent redating effort, one of several over the past few decades, and everyone present understands that the number this core produces could reopen a debate that has already flipped at least once before. Serpent Mound is the largest known serpent effigy mound in the world, stretching roughly 411 meters, about 1,348 feet, along the bluff. For scale, that's longer than most modern city blocks, and longer than the height of many of the tallest buildings constructed anywhere in the world today, laid flat across a hillside rather than standing upright. Seen from the observation tower built beside it, its coils are unmistakable, a deliberate, sinuous, single continuous shape built entirely from earth. With no burials and no obvious utilitarian purpose, its head oriented toward the edge of the bluff in a way visitors have puzzled over for well over a century. You look down the serpent's spine from the overlook and realize even the experts below you can't agree on who shaped it. Here is the old assumption embedded in how this chapter opens. Once a site has been dated and its likely builders identified, the question is generally considered closed, filed away, settled for future textbooks, the way Watson Brake's date is now settled, or the way Poverty Point's construction sequence is now broadly accepted. Serpent Mound refuses to cooperate with that assumption. For a long stretch of the 20th century, Serpent Mound was attributed to the Adena culture based on its apparent similarity to other Adena-era earthworks and burial practices in the region, with an estimated construction date around 800 BC. Then, in the 1990s, new radiocarbon results from charcoal samples recovered at the site pointed to a much later date, roughly 1070 CE, reassigning the monument to the Fort Ancient culture more than 1,000 years after the original Adena estimate. Museum labels were updated. Textbooks followed. That should have settled it. It didn't. More recent core sampling and renewed analysis have reopened the debate, with some researchers again favoring an Adena-era origin for the earthwork's core structure, arguing that the later Fort Ancient dates may reflect a period of repair or renovation to an already ancient monument rather than original construction. Others maintain the Fort Ancient dating is sound and represents the mound's true building period, pointing to the consistency of the 1990s radiocarbon results across multiple samples. This dating controversy is real, ongoing, and unresolved among the archaeologists actively working on it, not a manufactured mystery invented for dramatic effect, but a genuine, lived disagreement inside a serious scientific field, aired in academic journals and conference presentations, rather than settled by consensus. There is also a physical, on-the-ground texture to this debate that's easy to miss in a purely scientific summary. Each new coring effort means returning to a fragile, protected, actively visited public monument and removing new samples with extreme care, mindful of both the site's physical integrity and its ongoing cultural and historical significance. Researchers don't get to treat Serpent Mound as a disposable laboratory. Every sample taken represents a small, deliberate intervention into a monument that has already survived, largely intact for many centuries, and that constraint itself shapes how much new data can realistically be gathered, and how quickly any future resolution of the dating debate might arrive. The 2014 and later core sampling efforts referenced in this renewed debate used improved techniques compared to the 1990 study, including more careful sample selection aimed at avoiding exactly the kind of contamination that can skew older radiocarbon work. And yet, even with those improvements, the results didn't converge on a single, unambiguous answer the way the Watson-Brake dating eventually did. That difference between the two cases is itself informative. Watson-Brake's dates held up because multiple independent samples from multiple locations converged tightly. Serpent Mound samples, drawn from a monument with a longer and more complicated history of possible reuse, repair, and disturbance, have not converged in the same clean way, and archaeologists studying the site are candid that they may never fully converge, given the physical realities of the sampling material available. Part of what makes this so difficult to resolve is a limitation of the method itself. Radiocarbon dating relies on measuring the decay of carbon isotopes in organic material, like charcoal from a hearth or a construction event. But charcoal samples can be disturbed, mixed with older or younger material through natural processes or through the mound's own history of use and reuse, and datings drawn from contaminated or displaced samples can be off by centuries, in some cases by more than a millennium. A stray piece of older charcoal, washed or dug into a younger layer, can throw off a result in ways that are difficult to detect without extensive cross-checking. That single technical vulnerability is enough to keep two carefully conducted studies pointing in genuinely different directions. It helps to understand what the effigy itself actually looks like on the ground, beyond the aerial photographs most people see first. Walking the site, visitors follow a path alongside the serpent's body, its earthen coils rising only a few feet above the surrounding grass in most places, modest in height compared to Cahokia's mounds, but extraordinary in length and in the precision of its curves, which follow the natural contour of the bluff closely enough that some researchers have argued the builders deliberately incorporated the landscape's existing shape into their design, rather than imposing a shape onto flat, unremarkable ground the way the geometric Newark earthworks do. The observation tower, built well after the effigy itself, is the only place from which a visitor can see the full 7-coil form at once, a modern concession to a design that was never meant to be viewed from the sky by the people who built it, and yet reads clearly enough from above that early aerial surveys confirmed its serpentine shape almost immediately. The evidence suggests two competing, evidence-based possibilities rather than one confirmed answer. One interpretation holds that Adena-era people first shaped the serpent, and that later Fort Ancient communities, recognizing its significance, maintained or rebuilt sections of it centuries afterward, treating it less as an abandoned relic and more as a monument worth preserving across a cultural transition, the way a later society might restore, rather than replace something they inherited and still valued. The other interpretation holds that the entire effigy is a Fort Ancient creation from the start, and that the appearance of Adena-style construction nearby is coincidental proximity rather than shared authorship. Some researchers argue for the first option based on the mound's structural resemblance to confirmed Adena earthworks elsewhere. Others remain cautious, pointing out that resemblance alone is not proof of a specific builder or era. What can be said with more confidence is the shape, scale, and site itself. The earthwork's physical form is not in dispute. Its exact origin and the identity of the people who shaped it still is. That uncertainty is not a failure of archaeology. It's a demonstration of how archaeology is actually supposed to work when the evidence itself is genuinely ambiguous, competing hypotheses tested against new data, revised again as better methods become available, with researchers willing to say plainly that they don't yet have a final answer, rather than forcing a premature conclusion just to close the file. This is, in a sense, the opposite of the myth explored earlier in this documentary. The 19th century mound builder myth invented uncertainty where the evidence was actually available and clear, in order to avoid an uncomfortable conclusion. Serpent Mound represents real uncertainty, openly acknowledged by the scientists studying it, arising from the genuine limits of the physical evidence rather than from any reluctance to accept where it points. Both cases involve uncertainty. Only one of them involves honesty about it. Visitors who come to Serpent Mound expecting a settled, textbook answer often leave surprised to learn the debate is still live. That surprise is worth naming, because it says something about how the public generally expects science to work as a process that produces final answers filed away and closed. Real archaeological science, especially at a site with Serpent Mound's specific preservation and sampling challenges, more often produces provisional answers, held with appropriate confidence until better evidence arrives, rather than permanent verdicts. The site's continued popularity as a destination for visitors, researchers, and indigenous communities alike adds another layer to why the dating question matters beyond pure academic interest. Correctly attributing the monument carries real weight for descendant communities and for how the site's history is presented to the public through signage, guided tours, and museum materials at the Associated Visitor Center. An honest we don't fully know yet is, in this context, more respectful than a confident but potentially incorrect final answer would be. Even with modern radiocarbon dating, soil microstratigraphy, and decades of careful excavation and re-excavation, some questions about who built these monuments and exactly when remain genuinely open. That is worth sitting with, because it sets up an important contrast with what comes next. A site so large, so extensively documented, and so thoroughly excavated that there is no reasonable debate left about who its builders were, or how extraordinary their achievement was. There's a broader lesson embedded in the Serpent Mound case that applies to the rest of this documentary, and it's worth naming directly. Not every mystery in this story resolves the way the mound builder myth resolved, with a clear, evidence-based answer that a careful, well-funded, methodical survey could eventually settle beyond reasonable doubt. Some questions stay open not because nobody has looked hard enough, but because the physical evidence itself has genuine limits. Charcoal degrades. Samples get contaminated. Construction phases blur together over centuries of reuse and rebuilding. Serpent Mound sits right at that boundary between what science can determine with confidence and what it simply cannot yet resolve. And the honest thing for a documentary, or for the archaeologists themselves, to do is say so plainly, rather than force a tidy conclusion the evidence doesn't support. That distinction matters because it separates real, working uncertainty from the manufactured uncertainty the mound builder myth relied on. 19th century antiquarians claimed uncertainty about native authorship of the mounds, while ignoring evidence that was, in fact, available and conclusive. Modern archaeologists studying Serpent Mound face uncertainty because the physical record itself is ambiguous, and they say so precisely in peer-reviewed papers open to revision the moment better evidence surfaces. One is a failure of intellectual honesty. The other is intellectual honesty in action. That site lies roughly 300 miles to the west, across the Mississippi River. Near modern St. Louis, it is the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, and its full scale only became fully visible to researchers once they were able to see the ground from above. A modern LiDAR flyover passes low over the floodplain near present-day Collinsville, Illinois, and the laser mapping data strips away the trees, the roads, the modern fields, and the forest cover layered on top of centuries of farmland, revealing, underneath all of it, the full extent of a mound and plaza complex so large that no single vantage point on the ground could ever have shown it whole. This is Cahokia, and even researchers who had studied the site for years found the complete layout, seen this way, difficult to fully absorb. Dozens of mounds, causeways, and plaza boundaries emerging together in a single image, a scale of urban planning most visitors walking the grounds on foot would never fully register. Cahokia was occupied from roughly 700 to 1400 C, reaching its peak between about 1050 and 1150 C. 7 centuries of continuous or near-continuous occupation is, on its own, a significant span, longer than the entire history of the United States as an independent nation, concentrated in a single location that grew over that time. From a modest settlement into the largest urban center north of Mexico. During that peak, commonly cited scholarly estimates place its population somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, a range that itself varies by source and methodology, with some older or more popular accounts citing figures as high as 100,000. The documentary states the range honestly and notes the disagreement, rather than picking whichever number sounds more dramatic. Even using the more conservative, commonly cited range, one comparison lands hard. At its peak, Cahokia was larger in population than London was at the same point in history. Here is the old assumption this chapter needs to break directly, that pre-Columbian North America, north of central Mexico, never developed true cities. Only small villages, seasonal camps, or modest regional centers, nothing resembling urban planning on the scale found in Mesoamerica, Europe, or Asia during the same era. The physical evidence at Cahokia contradicts that assumption at every scale. The site originally contained around 120 mounds, of which roughly 70 survive today. Organized around planned plazas and connected to a network of satellite communities spread across the surrounding floodplain. A separate arrangement of large timber posts, identified near Cahokia's core, sometimes referred to by researchers as a solar calendar device, adds another dimension to the site's sophistication. Excavations have revealed several successive circles of posts, with alignments some researchers associate with solstice and equinox sunrise points as viewed from a central observation location. If that interpretation holds, it means Cahokia's builders were tracking and marking solar cycles with the same kind of deliberate, generation-spanning precision the Newark earthworks show for lunar cycles centuries earlier and hundreds of miles away. Two very different indigenous societies, separated by significant time and distance, both investing enormous effort into encoding astronomical knowledge directly into monumental construction. Multiple successive versions of these post circles have been identified at different depths, suggesting the structure was rebuilt more than once over the course of Cahokia's occupation. Itself a small piece of evidence for sustained generational investment in tracking celestial events, not a single one-off construction abandoned soon after. This was not an accidental cluster of structures. It reflects deliberate, large-scale urban planning, a monumental core covering an area of several thousand acres, designed with clear organizational logic. Plazas positioned deliberately relative to the largest mounds, rather than scattered without pattern. The scale of Cahokia's plazas deserves its own moment of attention. The Grand Plaza south of Monk's Mound spans dozens of acres, flat, open, deliberately leveled ground capable of holding enormous public gatherings, games, and ceremonies. Archaeologists have found evidence linking portions of the plaza to Chunky, a game played across much of the pre-Columbian Southeast and Midwest involving a rolled stone disc and thrown spears, suggesting the plaza served not only religious and political functions, but recreational and communal ones as well, a genuine public square in the fullest sense, not simply a ceremonial staging ground. Beyond the monumental core itself, archaeologists have documented a network of satellite communities spreading out across the surrounding floodplain and uplands, connected to Cahokia through shared material culture, shared architectural styles, and, presumably, shared political or religious ties to the central authority based at the main site. This is precisely the kind of settlement hierarchy, a dominant urban core surrounded by smaller, dependent, or affiliated communities that archaeologists elsewhere in the world use to identify true urbanism, as opposed to a simple cluster of similarly sized villages with no central organizing node. Cahokia had that hierarchy. It had a clear center, and it had a periphery that oriented itself around that center. Walking the site today, the sheer flatness of the surrounding floodplain does most of the work in making Cahokia's mounds feel improbable. There are no natural hills nearby to compare them to, no ridgelines or bluffs that might make a large earthwork look like a modest addition to an already varied landscape. The land here is river bottom, shaped by centuries of Mississippi flooding, flat enough that a person standing at ground level can see for miles in clear weather. Into that flatness, Cahokia's builders inserted dozens of deliberate engineered high points, the largest of which dwarfs everything around it. At the center of it all stands Monk's Mound. And this is where the flat Mississippi floodplain gives way to something genuinely startling, a sudden vertical shock rising roughly 30 meters, about 100 feet, from ground that is otherwise almost perfectly level for miles in every direction. Its base covers somewhere between 5 and 6 hectares, a footprint comparable to the Great Pyramid of Giza. Every bit of that structure was built entirely by hand, with earth carried basket load by basket load, an estimated tens of millions of cubic feet of soil moved without wheelbarrows, without draft animals, without metal tools, up ramps and terraces that had to be planned before construction began, not improvised as the mound grew. The mound building tradition on display at Cahokia also differs from earlier sites in this documentary in an important structural way. It wasn't a single earthwork or a single ceremonial complex, but an entire functioning city built around a hierarchy of mounds serving different purposes. Some mounds appear to have supported elite residences or ceremonial buildings on their summits. Others served as platforms for public ritual. Still others, like Mound 72, served as burial sites carrying deep religious and political significance. That functional diversity is itself evidence of a mature, differentiated urban society, not a single-purpose ceremonial gathering ground like Watson Brake or even Poverty Point. Cahokia had specialized architecture for specialized functions, the way any genuine city does. New sediment and microstratigraphy research, led by researchers including Sarah Schilling, has produced a finding that complicates the old, slower accumulation model even for a mound this massive. The analysis suggests Monk's Mound may have been built in as little as roughly 20 years, rather than across the many generations long assumed necessary for a structure of this size. If that timeline holds up under continued research, it means Cahokia's builders organized an enormous, sustained labor force capable of moving that volume of earth within a single generation, a level of coordinated mobilization that reshapes how researchers think about the society directing it, implying not just labor, but food supply, logistics, and authority sufficient to keep thousands of workers fed and organized across 2 decades of continuous construction. That would be simple, if not for one detail. A city this size, this planned, and this quickly built needed more than architecture to hold together. It needed belief, hierarchy, and organized authority strong enough to command labor at this scale. Cahokia's builders had all three. And one particular mound, excavated decades ago, would reveal exactly how far that authority extended, not just over earth and labor, but over life itself. You stand at the base of Monk's Mound and try to imagine 20,000 people below you on a single festival day, the plaza's full, the mound rising above the crowd the way a cathedral or a capitol building might dominate a modern city center, visible for miles across the flat floodplain, a landmark that would have organized the movement and gathering of the entire settlement around it. Cahokia's builders also left evidence of large-scale civil engineering beyond the mounds themselves. Excavations have identified massive wooden palisade walls, rebuilt multiple times over the site's history, enclosing significant portions of the monumental core, structures that would have required an enormous quantity of timber, harvested, transported, and set in place through coordinated communal labor. Whether these walls served primarily defensive purposes, ceremonial boundary marking, or both, is itself debated. What isn't debated is the scale of organization required to build and repeatedly rebuild them, on top of everything else Cahokia's population was already constructing. The comparison to contemporary London is worth sitting with a little longer, because it's easy to say and harder to really absorb. London in the 12th century was a walled medieval city with narrow streets, a cathedral under construction, and a population that historians estimate in a broadly similar range to Cahokia's more conservative population figures. Nobody teaches Cahokia in the same breath as medieval London in most standard American history curricula. That gap between the archaeological reality and the popular narrative is itself part of what this documentary is trying to close, not by claiming Cahokia and London were identical in form or function, but by insisting that scale deserves the same recognition regardless of which side of the Atlantic it happened on. Consider, too, what daily life at that scale would have actually demanded logistically, even setting the monumental architecture aside for a moment. Feeding a population in the range of 10 to 20,000 people, concentrated in a single urban core on a floodplain, required an agricultural and food distribution system capable of reliably supporting a population density far beyond what any earlier North American settlement had needed to manage. Maize agriculture in the surrounding fields would have had to be organized, planted, harvested, and stored at a scale matching the population it fed, itself a form of large-scale coordination distinct from, but just as demanding as, the labor required to build Monk's Mound. A city this size does not sustain itself by accident. Every mound, every plaza, and every satellite community sat on top of an equally impressive, if less visible, system for keeping that many people fed, housed, and organized year-round. Cahokia was recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982, an acknowledgement of exactly this scale of achievement. But the honors and the measurements only tell part of the story. The next layer, buried within a smaller ridgetop mound south of the main plaza, tells a much darker one, excavators working Mound 72. A ridgetop burial mound at the southern edge of Cahokia's monumental core brushed soil away from a skeleton laid across a bed of shell, and as more of it comes into view, the shape becomes unmistakable. Mound 72 itself is smaller and less visually dramatic than Monk's Mound, which is part of why its significance surprised even the archaeologists who excavated it. It doesn't announce itself the way Monk's Mound does, rising to dominate the skyline. It's a modest ridge-top structure, the kind of feature that could easily have been overlooked or dismissed as secondary. What excavators found beneath its surface proved to be some of the most significant burial evidence recovered anywhere in Mississippian archaeology. A reminder that a site's importance and its visible scale don't always correspond. The excavation of Mound 72 took place across multiple field seasons, with researchers gradually piecing together the sequence of burials over time rather than encountering the full scope of the site in a single dig. That extended timeline mattered for the interpretation itself, as more burials came to light season after season. The picture shifted from a single elaborate individual grave toward the much larger, more troubling pattern of mass sacrifice that the mound as a whole eventually revealed. Roughly 20,000 marine shell beads, arranged beneath and around the body of a man in his 40s, forming the deliberate outline of a bird in flight. Archaeologists came to call it the beaded burial, and the figure at its center, the Birdman. The name stuck in both popular and academic writing about the site, a shorthand for what remains one of the most significant single burial discoveries in North American archaeology. Pale shell beads catch the excavation lights as careful brushwork exposes bone beneath them, and for a while, the discovery looks like an extraordinary but relatively contained find, a single high-status burial, elaborately honored, the kind of individual grave that might appear in any society that marks status through burial goods. The excavation team works slowly, the way any careful archaeological team works around fragile remains, small brushes, dental picks. Patience measured in millimeters of soil removed at a time, each bead logged and mapped in place before it can be lifted, because the arrangement itself is part of the evidence, not just the beads. 20,000 beads is not a number that gets assembled casually. Each one had to be manufactured individually, likely by drilling and shaping marine shell transported from the Gulf Coast. Hundreds of miles from Cahokia itself, another thread in the same long-distance exchange network already documented at Hopewell sites centuries earlier, still very much active in Mississippian times, still capable of moving enormous quantities of a single prized material into a single ceremonial context. Here is the old assumption this chapter has to break, that mound burials at Cahokia, and in Mississippian culture generally, were relatively modest, largely egalitarian affairs, communal resting places without dramatic distinctions in status or violence. The rest of Mound 72 destroys that assumption almost immediately. Surrounding the central Birdman burial, excavators uncovered the remains of more than 250 additional individuals. Some were buried with apparent care and status markers of their own, others were not. Among them were mass graves containing dozens of young women, along with several men whose remains showed clear evidence of decapitation or the removal of hands. Physical trauma consistent with ritual execution rather than natural death or ordinary burial practice. Bioarchaeological analysis of the remains, examining bone density, growth patterns, and skeletal markers of activity and diet, has allowed researchers to say something about who these individuals were in life, beyond the manner of their deaths. Some analyses suggest differences in diet and physical activity between the central, high-status burials and at least some of the surrounding individuals. Consistent with a genuinely stratified society in which access to food, labor, and status varied significantly across the population, not just at the moment of death, but across entire lifetimes. Here is the problem, stated as plainly as the evidence allows: a society capable of building Monk's Mound, organizing a city larger than contemporary London, and running a continent-spanning exchange network was also a society capable of organizing large-scale ritual violence, apparently bound up with religious belief and cosmology. The falcon or birdman motif, recurring in Mississippian art elsewhere in the region, suggests the central figure in this burial was likely understood in mythic or cosmological terms, possibly a ruler, a priest, or someone ritually associated with a falcon deity or ancestral figure recurring throughout Mississippian religious symbolism found on engraved shell and copper across the wider Mississippian world. The exact social meaning is still debated. Was the central figure a ruler in a political sense, a religious leader, or someone selected to embody a mythic role in a specific ceremony? Archaeologists remain cautious about assigning a single fixed title because the evidence, bones, beads, position surrounding burials supports a picture of extraordinary status and ritual importance without spelling out the precise nature of that status in the political terms a modern viewer might expect. What the physical record does support clearly is scale. This was not an isolated act of violence, but an organized ritual event involving many victims, buried together, apparently as part of a single coordinated ceremony or a closely spaced sequence of ceremonies, requiring planning and requiring authority over dozens of lives at once. That is the implication worth sitting with. Cahokia had a rigid, structured social hierarchy. It had individuals or families with power significant enough to command not just labor, as Monk's Mound demonstrates, but human lives, as Mound 72 demonstrates. This was a complex, stratified society with the organizational capacity for architecture and for religiously sanctioned violence. Two sides of the same underlying capacity for large-scale coordination and control that made Cahokia's rise possible in the first place. It's worth situating this burial within the broader arc of everything examined so far in this documentary, because the contrast is instructive. Watson Brake, built 2,500 years earlier, shows no confirmed burials at all inside its mounds, despite 5 centuries of construction. Cahokia, at its peak, produced burial complexes elaborate and violent enough to require careful, cautious language even from professional archaeologists describing them today. Somewhere across those intervening centuries, mound-building traditions across the continent evolved from what may have been largely non-funerary ceremonial or territorial practices into deeply hierarchical systems bound up explicitly with death, status, and religiously sanctioned violence. That evolution is itself part of the larger story, evidence that these were not static. Unchanging traditions, but living, developing cultures whose practices shifted substantially across the thousands of years covered in this investigation. You watch the beads emerge one brushstroke at a time and understand you are looking at someone who once commanded thousands, and, just as clearly, at evidence of the other people whose lives were bound up in, and in some cases ended by, that same system of belief and power. It is not a comfortable thing to sit with, and the documentary shouldn't pretend otherwise. Great monuments and organized violence, here, come from the same source. The falcon motif itself deserves a closer look, because it recurs far beyond this single burial. Mississippian art across a wide region, engraved shell cups, embossed copper plates, carved stone, repeatedly depicts a raptorial, falcon-like figure, often associated with warfare, the upper world, and cosmological order, and later ethnographic and iconographic studies of related southeastern traditions. Archaeologists refer to this broader constellation of shared imagery as the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a network of symbols and motifs that appears at Mississippian sites well beyond Cahokia itself, suggesting the Birdman burial wasn't an isolated local invention, but a specific, richly resourced expression of a much wider shared belief system stretching across the Mississippian world. There is a broader pattern worth noting here, one that connects Mound 72 back to everything this documentary has already covered. Every major site examined so far, Watson Break, Poverty Point, the Hopewell Mounds, Cahokia itself, required organized, coordinated human effort well beyond what a single family or small band could manage alone. At Watson Break and Poverty Point, that coordination built earthworks. At the Hopewell sites, it moved rare materials across a continent. At Cahokia, by the time of Mound 72, that same underlying capacity for coordination had scaled up enough to organize not just earth and trade goods, but human lives, on command, as part of an integrated religious and political system. The capacity for monumental achievement and the capacity for organized violence were not separate developments. They grew from the same root, the ability to direct large numbers of people toward a single, sustained purpose. The mass grave findings, in particular, deserve to be treated with the same evidence-first care this documentary has tried to apply throughout. The physical evidence, the positioning of the bodies, the trauma visible on some remains, the demographic patterns skewing heavily toward young women in at least one of the pits, supports the interpretation of ritual sacrifice rather than a mass casualty event like a battle or an epidemic, which would typically produce a very different demographic and positional pattern. Researchers describe this cautiously, as the interpretation best supported by the available physical evidence, not as a certainty beyond any possible alternative explanation. But the weight of what has been found leaves little room for a comfortable, softened reading. Excavation of a site like Mound 72 is, by necessity, slow and quiet work. Very different from the popular image of archaeology as a series of dramatic single discoveries. Each layer of the mound had to be removed carefully, its contents mapped in 3 dimensions before anything was lifted, because the relationships between bodies, beads, and surrounding soil are themselves evidence. A shifted bone or a beadwork pattern disturbed during excavation is information lost permanently. The silence researchers describe in the lab, reviewing the accumulating data as the scale of the burial complex became clear, wasn't simply respect for the dead. It was the specific, professional silence of a team realizing, piece by piece, that the story the evidence was telling was larger and darker than the initial burial had suggested. A society capable of this much organized ritual authority and this much monumental construction might reasonably be expected to persist for centuries at its peak strength. Cahokia did not. Within roughly a century or two of reaching its height, the city that had once rivaled London in population and had organized labor forces capable of raising Monk's Mound in a single generation began to empty out, and the reasons why remain, even now, only partly understood. Researchers working along the floodplain surrounding Cahokia extract soil cores layered with sediment from repeated flood events, looking for the environmental fingerprints of a decline that shows up clearly in the archaeological record but resists a single, clean explanation. This kind of research depends on comparing multiple independent data streams against each other, sediment cores, settlement pattern surveys tracking how many households were occupied at a given time, and artifact assemblages that can help date specific phases of use or abandonment across different parts of the site. No single dataset tells the whole story on its own. It's only by layering these different kinds of evidence together, the way the soil itself is layered, that researchers can begin to reconstruct a plausible sequence of events across the 2 centuries of Cahokia's decline. Each of these data streams has its own limitations, which is part of why a confident single-cause explanation has proven so elusive. Settlement pattern surveys depend on how thoroughly a given area has been excavated, and large sections of the greater Cahokia region remain incompletely studied, sitting beneath modern farmland, roads, and development. Sediment cores capture environmental change with reasonable precision, but say nothing directly about political or social conditions. Artifact assemblages can help date phases of occupation, but rarely explain motive or decision-making. Put together, they sketch an outline. They do not yet fill in every detail inside it. The layers themselves tell part of the story, silt deposits from flooding, shifts in agricultural productivity, changes in settlement density across the surrounding region. What they don't provide is a smoking gun. The satellite communities surrounding Cahokia's core offer another piece of the puzzle, one that complicates any explanation focused purely on the central site itself. Some of these outlying communities appear to have declined or been abandoned before the core site's own population dropped significantly, suggesting the process of contraction didn't move uniformly outward from a single point, but unfolded unevenly across the wider Cahokian world, with different communities experiencing different pressures at different times. That unevenness argues against a single, simultaneous catastrophe and toward the more tangled, multi-causal picture archaeologists now favor. The evidence shows a population decline beginning sometime after roughly 1200 C, with the site experiencing full abandonment by sometime in the 1400s. 2 centuries is a long time by the standard of a single human life, but it is a relatively short window in archaeological terms, short enough that researchers can trace the decline with reasonable precision, even without being able to fully explain what drove it. That much is well documented in the archaeological record, a gradual emptying out over roughly 2 centuries, not a sudden collapse. Not a single catastrophic event that a viewer could point to and say, that's what did it. It's also worth acknowledging what this decline meant for the wider Mississippian world, beyond Cahokia's own borders. Cahokia was not the only Mississippian center, and the broader Mississippian cultural tradition, sharing artistic motifs, agricultural practices, and mound-building conventions, continued at other sites across the southeast well after Cahokia's own population had dwindled. Cahokia's fall, in other words, was not the end of the broader cultural tradition it belonged to. It was the decline of its single largest and most monumental expression, while related communities elsewhere carried related traditions forward for generations afterward. Here is the old assumption this chapter needs to challenge, that large, successful cities decline gradually from a single dominant cause, disease sweeping through a population, war or invasion, some singular catastrophic event that historians can point to and label as the reason. That is often how decline gets told in popular history, because a single cause makes a cleaner story, easier to remember and easier to repeat. Cahokia does not offer that clean story, and archaeologists are honest about it. No single confirmed cause explains the decline. Instead, the evidence points to a tangle of possible contributing factors working together, or in overlapping sequence, rather than one dominant trigger. Environmental stress, including flooding events documented in the sediment record, may have disrupted the agricultural base that supported the city's large population, damaging fields and altering the floodplain's productivity over repeated cycles. Resource depletion, the pressure of supporting tens of thousands of people and their satellite communities on a fixed floodplain landscape for centuries, may have gradually strained the systems that fed the city, including local wood supplies needed for construction, fuel, and the massive wooden palisades known to have surrounded parts of the site. Political fragmentation, as the central authority that once commanded labor on the scale of Monk's Mound weakened or fractured, may have undermined the cohesion holding the metropolitan area together. And social unrest, whether tied to the kind of hierarchical, sometimes violent power structures revealed in Mound 72, or to other internal pressures the archaeological record can't directly access, likely played some role as well. The flood deposit layers themselves are worth pausing on as physical evidence, because they function almost like testimony from the land itself. Distinct bands of silt within the soil cores mark individual flood events, some more severe than others, layered on top of each other across the centuries of Cahokia's occupation. Reading those bands in sequence, researchers can reconstruct a rough history of how often and how severely the Mississippi floodplain disrupted the agricultural fields that fed the city's tens of thousands of residents. A city this size, dependent on maize agriculture concentrated on a floodplain, was structurally vulnerable to exactly this kind of disruption in a way a smaller, more dispersed population would not have been. Some researchers argue environmental factors were the primary driver, pointing to the flood deposit layers as the clearest physical evidence available, and noting that a floodplain civilization is inherently vulnerable to the kind of hydrological shifts the sediment record shows. Others emphasize the political and social dimension, noting that environmental stress alone doesn't automatically explain the complete abandonment of monumental urban infrastructure this extensive, and that societies elsewhere have weathered comparable environmental pressure without full collapse. What can be said with more confidence is that these factors were likely interconnected rather than isolated environmental stress, straining a political and social system that was, in turn, less able to adapt and recover because of the very stratified, centralized structure that had made its earlier achievements possible in the first place. The implication is worth naming directly. The fall of a major American city, centuries before any European set foot in the region, remains only partly explained by modern science. That is not a gap in archaeological effort. It reflects the genuine difficulty of reconstructing complex social collapse from physical evidence alone, without written records from the people who lived through it to explain, in their own words, what they saw happening around them. Overgrown plazas mark the site today, silted floodplain layers holding the story of its slow emptying, and there's an eerie ordinariness to the land now compared to what it once held, quiet fields and forest where tens of thousands of people once gathered for festivals, labor, ritual, and daily life. You walk the empty plaza and try to reconcile its silence with the crowds it once held, and the gap between the two is difficult to close, even with everything the excavations have revealed. Here is the detail that carries the most weight, and the one this documentary keeps circling back to. The largest indigenous city north of Mexico had already emptied out, centuries before any European settler ever laid eyes on it. Whatever caused Cahokia's decline, it had nothing to do with contact, colonization, or any outside advanced influence arriving to end it. It ran its course and faded on its own terms, for reasons still being pieced together. And yet, when settlers finally did arrive in the region generations later and encountered its abandoned mounds, along with the hundreds of others scattered across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, they reached for exactly the explanation this documentary has been dismantling from the start: that someone else, someone more advanced, someone other than the ancestors of the native peoples still living nearby, must have built it. Some researchers have also pointed to the possibility of a self-reinforcing cycle rather than a single external shock. A large, centralized population straining local timber and agricultural resources could have made the community more vulnerable to flooding and crop failure. Flooding and crop failure could have weakened the authority of the leadership, whose legitimacy rested partly on ensuring prosperity and successful harvests. Weakened central authority could have made it harder to organize the kind of large-scale labor projects and possibly the kind of resource redistribution that had helped the city absorb earlier shocks. None of this is confirmed as the specific mechanism behind Cahokia's decline, but it illustrates the kind of interconnected, multi-causal thinking archaeologists now bring to a question that once might have been answered with a single word: invasion, or disease, or drought. The real picture, as far as current evidence allows, is more tangled than any single word can hold. Researchers have also examined whether disease might have played a role, given how densely populated Cahokia was at its peak. Dense populations elsewhere in world history have often proven vulnerable to the rapid spread of illness. So far, however, the skeletal and archaeological record has not produced the kind of clear evidence, mass burials consistent with epidemic mortality, for instance, that would support disease as a primary driver of the decline, the way such evidence exists for some well-documented epidemic events elsewhere in the archaeological and historical record. That absence doesn't rule disease out entirely as a contributing factor, but it does mean the evidence doesn't currently support it as a leading explanation either. It's also worth noting what didn't happen. There is no archaeological evidence of a sudden, violent destruction event at Cahokia, no citywide burn layer, no mass battle casualties dating to the site's final active years, nothing resembling the kind of dramatic downfall a documentary script might be tempted to invent for the sake of a clean climax. The decline reads, in the physical record, as gradual, fewer new structures, shrinking population density, satellite communities contracting before the core itself did. That gradual quality is, in its own way, part of the mystery. Sudden catastrophes leave dramatic evidence. Slow abandonment leaves only absence, and absence is far harder to interpret with confidence. That refusal would not be corrected by guesswork or good intentions. It would take a methodical, years-long scientific survey, one that finally treated the mounds as an evidence problem rather than a cultural argument, to settle the question for good return. For a moment, to the auger core from the opening of this documentary, the reddish clay pulled from the ground at Watson Break, the layer that had no business being as old as the lab results eventually proved. It was. You look at the same reddish clay from the very first scene and realize it was never evidence of someone else. It was always evidence of them, the direct ancestors of the native peoples who were living across this same landscape when settlers arrived, and whose achievement those settlers spent more than a century refusing to credit. The reckoning, when it finally came, arrived not through a single dramatic discovery, but through patient, methodical, unglamorous science. In 1894, Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology anthropologist Cyrus Thomas published the results of a survey that had taken him roughly 13 years to complete, the Report on the Mound Explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology. 13 years of sustained institutional commitment, funded through a federal agency, dedicated specifically to answering a question that popular myth had already claimed. For decades, was settled. Thomas had approached the mounds the way this whole investigation has tried to approach them, as a physical evidence problem, not a cultural argument. His team excavated extensively, and critically, they used stratigraphy, examining the layered sequence of artifacts and soil within and around mound sites, tracing which objects appeared in which layers, and connecting those objects directly, through style, material, and technique, to artifacts already known to belong to historic tribes, Cherokee, Shawnee, and others living in or near the same regions, whose material culture could be traced back, layer after layer, into the mounds themselves. The evidence suggests, and Thomas's report demonstrated with a rigor the myth-era antiquarians had never applied, an unbroken material connection between the mound-building past and the native nations still present in the 19th century. Layer by layer, artifact by artifact, the stratigraphic record dismantled all 5 of the recurring arguments that had propped up the mound builder myth for decades. The claims about primitiveness, about excessive age, about foreign inscriptions, about denial of authorship, about outside metal contact. None of them held up against direct, careful excavation and comparison. Conducted at a scale and with a level of documentation no earlier antiquarian survey had matched. Thomas's methodology deserves specific credit here because it represents a genuine turning point in how American archaeology was practiced. Rather than relying on surface impressions, measurements, and speculation about who seemed capable of building a given structure, his team dug systematically through mound layers, documenting exactly which artifacts appeared at which depths, and cross-referencing those artifacts against styles and techniques already firmly associated through direct historical and ethnographic documentation with specific historic tribes. When a mound's upper layers contain pottery styles, tools, or ornamental objects matching known Cherokee or Shawnee material culture, and those same styles could be traced downward through the mound's construction sequence without an unexplained break or substitution, the stratigraphic case for continuous native authorship became, layer by layer, essentially undeniable. That is the moment when nearly a century of manufactured uncertainty finally collapsed under actual physical evidence. It did not destroy the entire picture built up by earlier surveys like Squire and Davis's 1848 study. Much of that documentation remains valuable to researchers today, a record of sites since damaged or destroyed by later development. But it forced the field, and eventually the public, to redraw the most important part of the picture, the identity of the builders themselves. It's worth walking back through that full chain of evidence one final time, because no single site in this story carries the whole argument on its own. Watson Break alone proves monument building preceded agriculture in North America by thousands of years. Poverty Point alone proves hunter-gatherers could organize labor and long-distance trade at a scale once thought to require centralized states. The Hopewell interaction sphere alone proves these were never isolated regional cultures, but participants in a continent-spanning network of exchange and shared belief. Serpent Mound alone shows that real. Honest scientific uncertainty is not the same thing as the manufactured uncertainty the myth relied on. Cahokia alone proves that a genuine city, with genuine hierarchy, genuine urban planning, and a population exceeding contemporary London, existed on this continent centuries before European contact. None of these sites, individually, was ever meant to carry the entire argument. Together, laid end to end across 5,000 years, they leave no reasonable room for the story 19th century settlers told themselves instead. The mounting weight of the evidence covered in this documentary, from Watson Brake's radiocarbon dates pushing the timeline back nearly 2,000 years, to Poverty Point's staggering speed of construction and long-distance trade network, to the Hopewell Interaction Sphere's continent-spanning exchange of copper, mica, and shell, to Cahokia's urban scale and its darker evidence of hierarchy and ritual power, all of it points in the same direction, across 5,000 continuous years. The true builders were not a vanished outside civilization. They were indigenous peoples, adapting, organizing, and building on a scale that repeatedly outpaced what outside observers assumed was possible, generation after generation. Culture after culture, across a time span longer than the histories of many of the civilizations settlers imagined as the real builders instead. That is the real answer to the question buried in this documentary's title. The civilization so advanced it terrified early settlers was never a lost people from across an ocean, or a forgotten tribe of giants, or refugees from a sunken continent. It was always the direct ancestors of the Native American settlers were displacing, and the fear, when it existed, was never really about who built the mounds. It was about what accepting the true answer would have meant for the story settlers were telling themselves about the land they were taking. This is not a story that ends in total resolution, and it shouldn't pretend to. Serpent Mound's builders remain a genuinely open question, contested honestly between Adena and Fort Ancient attribution, even with modern dating techniques. Poverty Point's buried timber circles, discovered only recently beneath its plaza, have no confirmed purpose yet. Cahokia's decline remains a tangle of environmental, political, and social factors that researchers are still working to fully untangle. The mystery, in other words, isn't solved so much as it has been rightly attributed. The who has been settled by evidence beyond reasonable dispute, even where the why and the how still carry real, acknowledged uncertainty. That distinction between who built these places and exactly why, or exactly how each detail unfolded, is the honest shape of where the science actually stands today, and it's a shape this documentary has tried to hold on to from its opening scene to its last. The final image worth holding on to is not a triumphant one, and it shouldn't be dressed up as one. It's quieter than that. A soil sample, correctly labeled now, sitting in a drawer. A wind moving across a floodplain that once held tens of thousands of people, and now holds mostly grass and quiet. A serpent's coils, still watched over by an observation tower, still debated by the researchers who study it. The mounds did not need saving. They were never lost. They were only, for far too long, misread by the people standing closest to them. And what this documentary has tried to do, in the end, is nothing more complicated than reading them correctly, using the same patient, evidence-first method that finally settled the question over a century ago. Remarkably, even after Thomas's 1894 report scientifically dismantled the mound builder myth, versions of the lost race idea persisted at the margins for decades afterward, kept alive in some corners of popular and pseudo-archaeological writing long after the professional consensus had moved on, a reminder of how slowly a comfortable story can fade even after the evidence against it is settled. Today, that consensus is formalized in the clearest way institutions have to offer. UNESCO recognized Poverty Point as a World Heritage Site in 2014 and Cahokia in 1982. Both listings resting on the settled scientific understanding of who built them and why their achievement matters on a world historical scale, not a regional curiosity. The same wind that moved across Watson Brake 5,000 years ago still moves across it today, and across Cahokia's quiet, overgrown plazas, and across the serpent's coils on their bluff above the Ohio Creek. In museum cases now, the shell beads, the worked copper, the mica silhouettes sit correctly labeled behind glass, attributed at last to the people who actually made them, after more than a century in which that simple, evidence-supported truth was treated as too improbable or too inconvenient to accept. We know more than we did before. The scientific record on who built these monuments is no longer seriously in dispute. But the past still keeps something back. A builder's identity at Serpent Mound, a purpose beneath Poverty Point's plaza, a precise chain of causes behind Cahokia's long, slow emptying. Some of what happened here will likely never be fully recovered. No matter how many soil cores are pulled, how many samples enter the lab, or how many more layers researchers manage to read, it is worth returning one last time to the shape of the myth this documentary set out to dismantle, because the shape itself is instructive. The 19th century settlers who refused to credit native peoples with the mounds were not lacking access to evidence. They had European written accounts describing organized native societies. They had the mounds themselves, visible, measurable, undeniable. What they lacked was the willingness to let that evidence change the story they had already decided to tell about the land and the people on it. Cyrus Thomas's report didn't uncover secret previously hidden proof. It organized and rigorously tested evidence that had, in large part, already been sitting in plain sight for decades, waiting for someone to actually follow it wherever it led, rather than wherever it was comfortable to go. That is, in the end, the quieter and more uncomfortable twist beneath the dramatic one. This was never a story about a hidden civilization waiting to be discovered. It was a story about an obvious civilization that took a century of deliberate looking away to finally see clearly, and even now, in Serpent Mound's unresolved dating and Poverty Point's buried timber circles, and Cahokia's unfinished explanation for its own decline, the past is still not finished being seen. What has been recovered is enough to settle the central mystery this documentary opened with. The achievement was real. It was old, far older than most people assume, stretching back through 5,000 continuous years of indigenous history on this continent, and it was, for far too long, denied by people standing directly on top of the proof.